Welcome to Open Standards. My name is Christian Kaufmann, and it is my pleasure today to moderate this session. Before we start and talk about it, we have basically four sections, three questions from my side, which the four panelists will comment and answer from their experience and their background. And then we have, if timing allows, time for some questions from the remote participants or from here in the room, and then we wrap up. So that's the plan for today. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our four panelists. The first one on my left side is Roman. Roman is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. He's currently serving as the Internet Engineering Task Force Chair and as a Director on the board of the IGF Administration LLC. Next to him, we have Sarah Jennings. Sarah is Internet Standard Lead at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology at the UK government. In her role, she is responsible for leading the department's engagement at the ITF and W3C, advising on the impact of Internet and web standards on government policy initiatives. And she has previously been an advisor to the UK Parliament Selected Committee and the Government Chief's Scientific Advisor on the policy impacts on emerging technologies. Remote, we have two participants. Number one is Karen McCabe. She's a Senior Director of Technology Policy and Government Relationship at the EIII Standard Association and a global standards development body within the EIII, the world's largest technical professional organization. In this capacity, she leads efforts in engaging global initiatives aiming to foster collaboration between various stakeholders, including governments, industry, NGOs, and intergovernmental bodies. And last but not least, we have Mallory Knodel. She is the Executive Director of the SWF. She is a technology and human rights expert specialized in internet governance and digital policy. Mallory is active in the internet and emerging technical standards at the ITF, EIII, and the UN. Her background in computer science and civil society brings a unique perspective to the intersection of technology, policy, and human rights. And with that introduction, let's start part one. The concept of open standards can be interpreted differently by various stakeholders due to the context in which it is used. It could mean accessibility of standards or participation, voluntary adoption, among other interpretations, and it can lead to a diverse understanding. I will start with Roman. The ITF is the premier internet standards organization behind many of the technical standards and protocols that are the foundation of the internet. What is your perspective on open standards?
Oh, sorry. Hi. Can folks hear me? Yes. Louder? Okay. Is that a little better? Christian, thanks very much for having me on this panel, and this is really a great question because open standards can mean a lot of things to a number of different parties, and I'm curious to hear how my fellow panelists will also answer that. I'm sorry, I'm being signaled that I can't be heard?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I'm going to continue. So from my perspective, broadly, open standards means 5 different principles and adhering to that. First, it's about having a well-defined process that's transparent, it's inclusive, and it makes decisions through rough consensus. The second key principle is that it relies on a broad global community to develop those standards and make decisions on how those trade-offs occur based on their technical merit. Then after those standards are completed is really principle 3, that those standards are readily available for implementation to a broad community. And then recognizing that no standards organization can cover all the standards that need to be developed, and standards organizations need to work with each other to create large and interoperable kind of systems. And then lastly, the last principle is around those standards are now done, those standards are now being implemented. How does one judge success? And success is judged by their voluntary adoption. Now, as kind of given an introduction, I chair the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the standards development organization for the internet. And we implement those 5 principles in a little bit more of a specific kind of way, and I wanted to kind of talk quickly about that. First, it's this idea that everyone participates as an individual, and this means that everyone can come to the standards process and make contributions. We find that we have multi-stakeholder participation. A little more than half comes from the commercial sector, but the other half comes from government, civil society, and academia. The other thing we're kind of really keen on is recognizing that we need remote meetings and hybrid meetings. We don't want to make the ability to show up on site somewhere around the world as a barrier to participation in that standards process. So through that hybrid kind of mechanism, anyone can participate from around the world. And then crucially, we believe in radical transparency of our artifacts. All the proposals, all the final specifications, all the meeting minutes, agendas, mail archives going back decades are all publicly available on the internet, no login, for free for download. And then principally in those standards, as you review them, you'll notice that there's a focus not on building end-to-end solutions, but on building technology building blocks. So others can build on top of that and really enable the global permissionless environment that is the internet and has made it successful over the last several decades. Thanks.
Thank you a lot. Talking about hybrid, let's go to Karen. The IEEE celebrate its 140 years anniversary this year. It develops technical standards in various fields. Can you share with us your perspective on open standards? We do. Thank you, Karen. And next one, Mallory. Given your involvement in various standard organizations as well as your work on human rights, particular at the nexus of standards and technology, what are open standards through the lens of civil society? Thank you, Mallory. Sarah, governments actively participate and are also involved in relevant standards organization. From a government perspective, how do you view open standards?
Thanks, Christian, and likewise to echo my kind of fellow panelists, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this panel. I'm going to take this off because I can hear myself. So you're right, the UK government in particular is very actively involved in a range of standards development organisations, including but not limited to ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, the IETF, the ITU and 3GPP. And we're engaged and we do that because we think it's absolutely critical for government, but for all stakeholders to be involved in the standards process, to contribute and to kind of be engaged and to encourage the development of open standards. I think fellow panelists have touched on a lot of the kind of characteristics of open standards in terms of the process, in terms of the output, in terms of the scrutiny that kind of happens. I think if I could kind of sum it up, I would say open standards means that no one is de facto excluded from the process and from the output. I wanted to sort of slightly reframe the question and touch on, because government cares a lot about open standards, not just because of kind of the way that they are developed, but also because of what they enable and what they kind of mean for the wider sort of UK economy. So two elements of that. One is around competition. So crucially, with the open standards, helps to encourage new entrants into markets, right? They serve as building blocks for further innovation. They mean that there is a fair, competitive market for implementations. They don't lock customers into a particular vendor, and they kind of mean that there is unrestricted competition between vendors and unrestricted choice for consumers. I think that's absolutely critical for enabling innovation and for enabling economic growth. And then the other element I think that open standards are crucial in enabling is interoperability, as Karen touched on, right? That particularly in the case of the internet, the open standards that underpin it have interoperability as the primary goal. You know, you can have several implementations in compliance with a single standard, and that enables scalability, stability, and resilience in the system, kind of three crucial elements of the internet that enables the global connectivity that we so rely on today. So I think we see open standards as absolutely invaluable, and we kind of are very happy to be involved and hope to continue being so.
Thank you, Sarah. With that, we move to part 2, where I can play a little bit devil's advocate. Why are open standards better than closed ones? What are the advantages of open standards compared to government or proprietary standards from large companies or vendors? And in what situation are they more beneficial? Are closed standard models more practical than open standards, which often involve lengthy discussions that can last for years? And with that one, I would like to give it first to Mallory.
Yeah, thanks for having me come in first on this one. I think it's important, especially for civil society, that these are open. Open doesn't necessarily mean accessible or affordable. You know, those, we can put that aside for one moment, because I wanted to spend my short time actually describing an example. So a lot of what civil society organizations have to do, because, you know, if we think of the three stakeholder groups, and I apologize to the technical community and academia for a moment, but if we think about governments, the private sector, and civil society really has no power, right? I mean, we might have people power, but we have no ability to change technology or to enforce laws. So it's just a lot of advocacy, right? And a lot of that, when you're then talking to companies, is direct corporate advocacy that often just happens behind closed doors, or and that's just the nature of it, right? These are products, these are relationships that have been built. And so if there are, you know, flaws in a technology, or ways that civil society really thinks that you know, technology might need to change, we have no choice but to sort of do this either under NDA or other things. So what's wonderful about open standards is that you can now do this direct corporate advocacy in the light of day, in a way that's documented, in a way that is sort of, there's a record of it. So it's easier to refer back to things, to watch progress over time. I think everyone benefits from that. One example of this is some ongoing work in the Internet Engineering Task Force called the Detecting Unwanted Location Trackers work. So this is a tile or any kind of device you can buy that can track your things, but it can also be used to track people. And that has been in the press for a very long time, and trying to get the manufacturers of those technologies to understand the risk of stalking with those tiles was done with direct corporate advocacy, more or less, kind of behind closed doors, and just through email and meetings and that sort of thing. Once that work, so one of the tactics that my organization at the time, the Center for Democracy and Technology, took in those meetings was to really suggest strongly that the manufacturers come to the IETF with these specifications for how to detect them if you don't want it tracking you. And they did so. And it's been really excellent to see the cooperation, the consensus building, the discussion all happening at the IETF. And very wonderfully, you can watch the meetings on YouTube because they're recorded. You can subscribe to the mailing list to read the discussion, and you can read the specification and even potentially change it if you have a particular use case or an experience. The other thing I really love about that work is that they've appointed as one of the chairs of the working group an actual person from a most affected community. So one of the staff people at the National Network to End Domestic Violence in the United States is co-chairing that working group with someone from the IETF. So it's just a wonderful example, and I think we should see more of that. I hope. Thanks.
Thank you, Mallory. Sarah.
I found a really good quote from Tim Berners-Lee. Many people, I'm sure, sort of will often find these kind of tidbits of valuable information from him. But it was that the decision to make the web an open system was necessary for it to be universal.
Sorry.
All right, thanks, Adam. I'll start again. The decision to make the web an open system was necessary for it to be universal. You can't propose that something be a universal space and at the same time try to keep control of it. And I think universality and globality cannot happen without open standards, that we can't really have the internet that we have today without them. One element that I want to kind of narrow down on, and Mallory was touching on this, is who is involved in the standards work. So within UK government, we're strong advocates of the multi-stakeholder industry-led model for the development of digital technical standards. And we want to ensure that they deliver for all by advocating a greater diversity of involvement throughout the whole standards development process. So that means a wide variety of perspectives. That means operators, vendors, consumer groups, it means civil society groups, engaging on all of the issues that are being considered within SDOs. But that also is valuable for itself, it's valuable for the process, but it's valuable to get the kind of best quality technical outcome. For UK government, what that means in practice, we model multi-stakeholder delegations to standards development organisations, and we're also supporting efforts to widen and improve the talent base in standards development organisations from UK companies. We work directly with multi-stakeholder SDOs, and we prioritise open standards in our procurement. And we're also committed to better understanding the barriers that might be faced for people engaging in standards development organisations and kind of considering how those should be addressed. We recognise that openness isn't a binary state. It exists on a spectrum, and it's something that is kind of constantly needs to be worked towards. We generally support standards being developed in the organisation that has the kind of requisite technical competence and capability to be able to do that, whether that's IEEE for Ethernet, for example, or 3GPP for the next generation of mobile standards. And we encourage each of these bodies to kind of pursue openness and to the greatest degree possible within their inputs and their processes, noting that there kind of might be constraints in the way that they operate. But ultimately, I think it comes down to open standards are valuable because everyone can get involved, and that is not a given for closed standards.
Thank you, Sarah. Roman.
So Sarah and Karen have already, I think, really eloquently talked about some of the key advantages of open standards about it accelerates innovation, it encourages competition, and it reduces cost. So I want to pick at a slightly kind of different dimension of this to really say, when you have something like the internet, which is rapidly evolving and it has a tremendous number of stakeholders, the only way you can approach standardization is you have to make it open, because that's the only way you're going to ensure that you have all of the necessary stakeholders participating. And a little bit in the setup of the question, I also kind of heard this idea of, well, aren't closed standards to a certain degree kind of faster? And the way I would volley really back to that is, when you consider the societal scale and the societal impact of kind of the internet, being to the market first or kind of fastest is really only one of the many dimensions you need to trade off when you work with a large multi kind of stakeholder community. One of the real critical advantages, back to the idea of having so many stakeholders of this open process, is that you get broad and diverse reviews from all the different communities. This is a little bit what Sarah was talking about. You get global experts, not from just one particular community. You get the technical experts, you get the private sector, you get governments, you get civil society, as Mallory was talking about, you get academia. And my belief is that when you bring together all of those experts, you actually end up with a higher quality of standard that really ultimately stands the test of time in implementation and adoption, and drives the digital economy, and scales to the needs and the diversity that happens across the internet. Back to the idea of kind of examples, I want to drill a little bit, into kind of two examples of where the ITF, that's sometimes perceived as just kind of the technical community, but in fact is quite multi-stakeholder, took that input into the organization, and it dramatically changed the standardization activity. So that first example is around TLS, which is one of the most widely deployed protocols to secure everything from websites to mobile apps, healthcare data, and kind of financial services data. We had a very heavy participation from academia that came to that specification, and they brought a particular expertise called formal verification, which is using mathematical models to prove the security properties of protocols. In this case, they took it to TLS. And it turns out their contribution was phenomenal because they found flaws in the design. And because the academic community was participating as a first-class stakeholder and was able to discover that, bring that to the standards process, the protocol was able to be revised, and by the time it shipped, it was more secure from the start, because in the absence of that participation from academia, there would have been latent vulnerabilities in the specification, which would have resulted in latent vulnerabilities in the products that implemented it. And the other example I just want to repeat, because it also is fantastic, is the one that Mallory mentioned, which was the ongoing work that the ITF was doing around standardizing detection of unwanted tractors, as kind of Mallory kind of framed really their implication for intimate partner kind of violence because of their ability to use for stalking. Compositionally, the technical community and largely the government also did not have the domain expertise in those technologies. It was those gender-based violence experts coming to the IETF that really educated the technical community, the commercial sector, and governments on the requirements and the threat models around that, and those became requirements that the entire SDO is now engineered kind of for. And so just to reiterate what I said, kind of what Sarah has said, bringing together all of those experts as equal participants in the process leads to higher quality standards, and that's exactly what we want when we field for something as broad as impactful as the internet. Thanks.
Thank you, Roman. Karen, why are open standards better than closed ones?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. And from being in the standards space for a few decades now, and of course working for the organization that I'm with, IEEE, we do advocate and prefer, I would say maybe we prefer open standards, but I would have to say, just to add a few dimensions, to the discussion we're having on this particular question, I think, there are various forms of standardization, right? And they actually serve, one way of looking at it is various purposes. And I'm just going to sort of add another dimension here, right? So, one way of looking at it is often, there's a need for stability. And I think that is provided by, the arena of formal standards bodies such as, IEEE and, those open processes that we have, right? But, other things that we haven't really touched upon so far in our conversation is, there's also sometimes a need for addressing or coping with really fast change. And we didn't really bring into the conversation the role of consortia or alliances, which might be viewed as more closed or proprietary. So, there's a role for that as well. And sometimes, standards, or what really would be called a specification, might be developed in a consortia or alliance. And then there's a sort of a broader need to bring that to the more of a global market. So then they go into more formal standards bodies like IEEE, but there is, sort of a role for that. And, not that necessarily saying that open source is a form of, standards body, but, then there's also that connection to standardization and open source and that, that level of community involvement. So, it's an interesting question because I think, there are these various types of processes and organizations developing standards. I would say, overall they need to sort of work together in a way. We talk about interoperability. It's like these various systems of standards probably need to be interoperable as well, right? We look at really this emerging standardization need, when we think of such mega systems. One way of looking at, like when we think about these growing digital platforms, all these different components and dimensions that we're addressing from 6G and beyond. When we think about connected persons, e-health, mobility, the future of mobility, right? The groups within each of those I guess, areas or arenas of how they develop standards, formal standards bodies, open standards bodies, consortia, whatever, they really need to effectively work together, right? We're going to look at how we're going to achieve the public good character of standards through open systems, right? So one way I would say to accomplish this, open standardization could be preferred compared to closed proprietary solutions. But sometimes the road to an open standard might be through a proprietary way as well, and then it gets into an open standard. Just to kind of put that into context here, I think open standards really provide the development of a unified digital ecosystem. All this technology and digital transformation, doesn't really stand alone. And I think when we think about it through the lens of compatibility and interoperability, openness is really going to be the foundation for the technology that needs to interoperate and match, the needs and the future that we're looking to have here, right? So how we do sustain the growth of these complex systems in these digital domains really requires a consensus and an agreement on how it's going to work. And I think this is really where open standards can serve such a significant purpose for the various reasons my colleagues have noted here, from the level of multi-stakeholderism, various voices, diversity of opinions, and insights. That level of expertise really coming into the standards development process and developing a standard is so critical, because then you sort of get the best output, if you will, when you think about that. So I think that's where open standards might sort of stand above, if you will, proprietary standards. But again, just to note that there are reasons for proprietary standards and driving factors in the market and whatnot, that they do have their role. Just to kind of push back a little bit on that, but I'll end there. But just wanted to add those other dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Karen. The IGF sometimes get criticized a little bit that there's a lot of fluffy talk and not particularly concrete this week. So I want to counter that a little bit. And with my next question, we have already heard some examples, especially from Roman, where open standards worked very well. But I want to dive still a little bit deeper into that. So what are examples where open standards worked well, and why did they work well? Can we start with you, Sarah?
Absolutely. So I think one element of open standards that we sort of touched on a little bit as to their benefit is that because they're kind of generally freely or available at kind of very low price, they're extremely valuable in terms of promoting widespread uptake of a particular behavior or implementation of a standard. And that's particularly the case for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, for whom cost can be a relatively significant barrier. And I wanted to give an example of a piece of work that happened in ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standardization Institute. And this was actually started by the predecessor department to my department, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And what happened was recognizing an issue with IoT devices, that IoT devices could often be relatively insecure by design. Despite their kind of their ubiquity within the home, they were kind of making people's lives enjoyable and easier. They were also exposing people to a great degree of kind of threat and insecurity. And the department came up with a code of practice for consumer IoT security, a sort of set of best principles that should be implemented at the design stage to ensure that IoT was secure. So just to give a very basic example of how that manifested, it meant either not setting the default password as admin and username admin, or requesting that users change the password on the kind of first use of the device. A really simple change that kind of was designed to bolster the security of the devices. And the identifying that there kind of was no relevant global standard that was addressing that issue, the department, in conjunction with the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is the UK's Centre of Expertise in Cybersecurity, decided to introduce the work item into ETSI. And this led to a standard being published in 2019 and then kind of was transferred into a European standard in 2020. And that now underpins the security requirements. I've got a list here for consumer IoT in the UK, but also has had widespread international adoption and underpins the domestic schemes in Australia, Finland, Germany, India, Singapore, and Vietnam. And DCIT, the kind of successor department, is continuing work on that and continuing to update the code of practice. But from the start, that work was sort of framed in the context of open standards. We saw a need and a gap within the security landscape and brought it to ETSI to be able to get their technical competence and their wide range of stakeholders. ETSI it's a global open organization, and that was crucial for getting widespread visibility of the standard across a range of different countries. And then finally, it's freely available, right? Which means that manufacturers are much more able to ensure that their products are secure by design. So I think that's one example of where open standards can be really helpful in terms of promoting best practice and good behavior.
Perfect, thank you. Karen, do you have an example for us?
Yes, I do. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you for it. It's, I guess, how we want to define, what worked well, what does that mean, and what didn't work well, from an open standards perspective and, sort of through the lens of the other components of open standardization. When we think about market-driven bottom-up standardization, one way of looking at it could be that, if it didn't work well, could be that it was maybe before the market was ready for it, sort of a standard before its time, right? Because the adoption of standards, is really by the market or the end users. And and sometimes standards are very, very niche as well. So if we're defining work well by, a limited amount of adoption, it could just be such a niche industry, but it's very needed and it's very practical. So just, wanted to add that into the mix here as we're discussing, what when it comes to work well or didn't work well. From a worked well kind of perspective, just probably should come to no surprise. I'll talk a little bit about the IEEE 802.11 wireless or Wi-Fi standard. This is a standard that basically then evolved to a family of standards. So just to note, standards are living documents per se. It's sort of doesn't come out into the world and just, sits there. It's innovated upon onto itself, things in technology, market drivers, whatnot change. So the standards and the people developing those standards really always have to pay attention to it and update it and revise it. And though all that kind of comes along with this very complex standardization process. But the 802.11 wireless or the Wi-Fi standard really, just to set stage, I'm sure everyone here is probably familiar with this. That really defines protocols for wireless local area networks, and it really kind of came onto the scene in the mid 1990s, and has been greatly regularly updated based on those evolving needs that I mentioned. When you think about higher speeds, improved security, support for more devices, and how spectrum is evolving and whatnot. But the success also and what's working well is sort of also aligned with how that standard is being maintained and updated as well, just to throw that in here. Back to the 802.11, the wireless standard, I think we all, as we're sitting here with connected devices and Wi-Fi and being able to do our work remotely and schooling remotely and all the amazing things it really has enabled this sense of global interoperability where devices from different manufacturers can connect seamlessly because they adhere to this standard. Has enabled tremendous innovation, allowing companies from all sizes to innovate, spurring a broad ecosystem of devices and applications and services that are reliant on Wi-Fi and that enable a lot of what we experience today. It really helped ensure scalability right through that iterative process and updates to really kind of keep meeting those growing needs and demands from smart homes to enterprises, smart cities, and beyond. And I think we've touched upon this when we think about the impact of standards as well. It really has helped when it's that ubiquitous reduced development costs. And we did another speaker to talk about avoiding, sort of that vendor lock-in situation as well. And it's really helped avoid that as well, really making Wi-Fi basically accessible and generally affordable for consumers because it's so widely deployed around the world. And the success factor there is really, it has become sort of the de facto standards for wireless networking. So that process of how that standard was developed early on in the 1990s, meeting the needs of the evolving market and how it was used as building blocks, if you will, for innovation and how it's been maintained. Really is kind of a great, I would call a case study. So, sort of what works well in open standards. But thanks for the question.
Thank you, Karen. It's funny. That Wi-Fi wasn't the first one coming to my mind, but now as you talked about it, I take it so for granted and it's so natural, but it is such an awesome example for something every one of us uses. So, Mallory, do you have an example for us?
I do, and it's such a perfect setup because mine is about the 802.11 group, but a really specific change. So let me start first by saying, before I got involved in standards, I was working at the Association for Progressive Communication, and I, with a background in education and technology and science, was doing digital security trainings for journalists, human rights defenders, community members most at risk. Teaching them how to use PGP email and other kinds of things that are really hard to do. We don't have to do them so much anymore because things have changed. And what was so compelling to me about standards was that instead of kind of going one by one to fix the security issues that people were facing, you could actually just change the way the technology worked for everyone all over the world. Like, that to me was so refreshing, and provided just such a value proposition for why civil society should get engaged. So, folks still need to clean up their digital security, especially if they're most at risk. I don't have to tell folks in the room this, but that, getting involved in standards could potentially change things for everyone. So the example I have in 802.11, which I don't have to go into explaining what that is. Thank you, Karen and Christian. There was a change. So when I worked with someone named Amelia Andersdotter, who was following the 802 groups. And she started working on this draft specification in the Wi-Fi standard so that routers would, by default, randomize MAC addresses, the MAC addresses of the devices that connected to it. So MAC randomization was a feature that existed, but you had to turn it on. So just to describe why this is important, if you travel in airports, which all of you do, if you go to the same coffee shops over and over again, the wireless infrastructure in those places could potentially track you over time because every device you have has a unique identifier. And when you authenticate to the wireless network, previous to this change, you would be giving over that unique identifier in order to get on the network. So specifying the Wi-Fi standard to randomize that, to obfuscate that unique identifier by default, changes the security for everyone potentially. So this change goes into all of the consumer routers that are on shelves all over the world. It goes into sort of every place over time. So this is one example. I know it seems like such an incremental, tiny change, but that had human rights implications and had digital security implications, which is something I knew very well from working on the ground with people most affected by things like this, seemed like really incredible. And so it's a minor example, but to me, it's a foundational example.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Roman, you already touched on one or two, but do you have another one or want to?
I do have another one. So if everyone just remembers back a couple of years where we had the COVID pandemic, I can't think of a more transformational set of kind of technology that saw widespread kind of adoption impacting education, kind of the way governments operate, and, medicine, and frankly, just staying connected with our loved ones. Then all that video conferencing applications, almost overnight, we started integrating daily into our workflows. That underlying protocol used by different services, to include the one that's streaming kind of this kind of right now, bringing things to billions of users, was an IETF developed protocol called WebRTC. This wasn't the first time that there was audio video kind of technology. Previously, it was restricted to expensive appliances in corporate kind of settings, or perhaps it was unreliable things kind of on the desktop. And so what the standardization around WebRTC in the IETF animated was ensuring that technologies work at scale and on the diversity of the kind of the internet. There was focus on interoperability of just a mobile device, a laptop device, a hardware kind of device, new models, kind of old models, just kind of web browsers, and also being sensitive to the fact that the internet, the quality of kind of internet connectivity with latency and bandwidth varies all around the world, and it needs to work in all of those different kind of constraints. And if you also look at the specifications of all those drafts, it's about 40 to 50 documents. It goes back to what we've been talking about before. It takes a huge village of experts to do it. You see authors from big tech service providers, you see equipment manufacturers, you see open source, academia, and civil society, all as primary authors on the draft, because that's what it takes to cover the diversity of use cases that is ultimately the internet. And one we haven't talked so much about, but Karen has kind of mentioned, because certainly the IETF and the IEEE work together. This was a case where we worked in the IETF with the World Wide Web Consortium, the W kind of 3C, also kind of as well. So, I mean, plenty of examples to talk about, but I'll really kind of stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. We are behind time as a... no, it works again. We are behind time, as I was already told. Nevertheless, do we have a question? Martin has one, a quick one.
For the sake of time, thank you. This works. Okay, thank you. Well, you don't have to convince me for open standards, I'm fully in. If we talk about people who talk about open standards more policy level, the concerns are that permissionless innovation is often misunderstood. So maybe good to say, to be more clear on that, permissionless innovation doesn't mean everything goes. And the other thing is the capture, and by certain parties, governments or big business. And you've been dealing with that over time as well. Can you say a little bit more about how you're going to avoid that this is going to be a problem and that it's going to be better understood?
I mean, I'll respond to the permissionless innovation. I mean, you're exactly right. It doesn't mean anything goes. Permissionless innovation in this particular case means that when a standards organizations, whether it's the, I'll speak for the IEEE or the kind of the IETF puts out a standard, you don't need to go ask them to use those building blocks to make new kind of applications and kind of innovate what's ultimately possible. And then I think to answer kind of quickly, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panelists, relative to kind of capture, this is one of the reasons why the IETF operates on the principle everyone's an individual, and everyone from all manners of kind of contribution can come to the organization, and that's primarily the mitigation. In addition to that, and the rough consensus process that we follow, very similar to what the IEEE follows.
Thank you. Do other panelists have something to add as well?
I could jump in.
Please.
I can't see if Sarah had.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks. No, I think this is important where policy comes in. So we have a problem with really consolidated markets because really huge tech companies, particularly in the US, haven't been regulated enough. And so that spills into the standards process. I think this has also a sort of feedback loop happening. I will just reflect that I think sometimes the major tech companies don't have interesting enough problems, which I think is too bad, right? There are small community networks, there are small businesses, as Sarah brought in earlier, that have more interesting problems, but their solutions and their standards are not, or their ideas are not really getting heard. And I think that that's an unfortunate side effect of this. And I also think that it's self-reinforcing because sometimes you get solutions, standards, architectures that preference cooperation between big companies and don't. And this is essentially kind of boils down to like a network neutrality kind of violation, which for all the really interesting principles and architectural principles in the IETF is not really codified or explicitly addressed. I think maybe the permissionless innovation is like the easiest one to point to, but that's also an oversight. And I think for like to revive and really lean into net neutrality could be somewhat of a solution to this problem, although not like a perfect one, because it takes kind of everyone to solve this hugely consolidated market issue.
Thank you. Sarah?
I guess the kind of comment I wanted to make was going back to my first answer about the idea that open standards means that no one is de facto like eliminated from the process. And I think open standards could be interpreted as a sort of completely laissez-faire approach to standards development. But I think in reality, how it functions and how each of the institutions, each of the standards development organizations operates is to have governance mechanisms in place to either enable particular individuals to contribute. And sometimes that means kind of making sure that there's not an overarching dominance of particular voices within a conversation. So for example, I'm going to speak in Roman's turf, but the IETF has limitations on the number of individuals from a particular company who can serve on the IAB, right? You can't have more than 2 people from one particular company. And that's a guard against that kind of dominance that you described. So yes, there can be loud voices in a room, but I think it's incumbent upon all SDOs to implement the kind of governance processes and cultures that mean that people can contribute where they have things to say.
Thank you. We slowly have to wrap up. We're coming to an end. Nevertheless, I want to give every panelist 1 minute to give us their takeaway about open standards. What should people here in the room take away? Or a summary of the parts you said. Can we start with Karen?
Gee, thanks. Well, first of all, again, a big thank you. For me, I just think, especially as we're grappling with unintended consequences of technology, new technologies really rapidly advancing, open standards are going to remain a very, very critical pillar of that ecosystem, but also noting, that there are other aspects, if you will, of open source and proprietary standards, if you wanted to find them coming out of consortia, and how we need to keep an eye on how this, we'll need to interoperate, I guess, so that we can meet the challenges that might be in front of us.
Thank you. Mallory?
Yeah, I think I'm the only one who hasn't weighed in on this question of closed standards versus open standards. I just didn't address it on my comments, but I think it's important from the perspective of civil society because I also work in the ITU. We haven't really talked about that very much, but it is, I think maybe people would trouble the idea that it's closed. I certainly think it is. You can't look at the documents or the mail reflector unless you are a member of a delegation or an observer member. And I think what I want to say is that what you get between the two, the major difference for me and in my situation is you don't get civil society, but you get plenty of industry. So a lot of country delegations are comprised of national industry, and they're part of the delegation. So you kind of get both. So you could, and the ITU does like do a fair amount of standardization. What you don't get is you don't get a lot of observers. You don't get civil society on delegations, and you don't get a lot of then sort of large groups, like the, Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights or other kinds of groups that would ostensibly be interacting with that process like you could have in something that is truly multi-stakeholder. So I guess that sometimes can be a question at the IGF. There's a lot of participants that are very active, very keen from governments. I think that would just be a sort of message there that we should be pushing these more closed multilateral bodies to become more multi-stakeholder. And I think the best argument we have is that the internet works because the multi-stakeholder standards organizations work.
Perfect. Thank you. Roman?
Mallory ended it the way I would have. The internet has worked for many decades and it connected billions of people through its open standards and multi-stakeholder approach. With so many different stakeholders and such high stakes, it is the only way to proceed and continue.
Sarah?
And I guess my comment would be that openness is not a destination. It's something that continually needs to be sort of maintained and forged, and it's incumbent for kind of all groups to be involved in standards development. It's incumbent upon all organizations to work to make their work open as possible. So openness, not a single place. It's something to kind of keep advocating for, and I hope that people here have kind of seen the value of open standards.
Thank you. The title of the session was "The Future of the Internet is Built on Open Standards." And there wasn't a question mark behind, but I think after that meeting, hopefully for everyone, there is an exclamation mark behind that sentence. Thanks a lot for joining, and wish you an awesome week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks to the panelists again.